In painting, one of my absolute favorite periods in art is called the Baroque period. Baroque. I think that's how you spell it. I'll double check, right? One of the reasons why I love the Baroque period, which includes Rembrandt, for example, sometimes Peter Paul Rubens, is that one of the things about the Baroque period that I really like is the use of both light and shadow. This is also a very common theme in horror and a very common theme in Gothic art. Gothic is oftentimes used to refer to architecture, but it's also sometimes referred to literature. The term Gothic, right, in terms of architecture, inspires us to think about something that's overly ornate. We think about Gothic cathedrals with gargoyles and all sorts of excessive decoration, right? The term Gothic became associated with horror because we thought of things like Gothic cathedrals and Gothic castles and, you know, some deformed Quasimodo up in the bell tower, things like that. So Gothic became this other term that refers to both dark, which is funny because Gothic architecture was all about light, not dark. If you look at original Gothic cathedrals, the whole point of them on the inside was to let more light in. But Gothic, because of its association with ornate and gargoyles and all these other things, it became associated with darkness and horror, right? And one of the things that Gothic literature does and horror literature does very well, and we have in Jekyll and Hyde, not something which is really Gothic literature, but it definitely is an inheritance of the Gothic literature. It's highly influenced by it. We have this term going on and how it's telling its story called chiaroscuro. It's spelled chiaroscuro, right? And what this means in the art history terminology is simply light and dark. It's a technique, right, that's really, really common in certain Baroque paintings. It's also very common in one of my favorite artists by the name of Caravaggio. We have some Caravaggio reprints in the library, if you've seen, and it's very, very common. But the idea of chiaroscuro, light and dark, is to tell a story through the contrast of light and dark. What we see in terms of the contrast that's being shown in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, some of that contrast is really obvious, right? We've got good and evil, right, of Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll, Dr. Henry Jekyll usually refers to the good. Mr. Hyde is going to refer to the evil. But we also have some other contrast that we've seen. We have the contrast of the whole house, right? But it also has the dark laboratory, right? We also have the idea of the whole house, again, used as a slightly different contrasting metaphor, with the apartment flats next door, right? The idea of the whole versus the divided self, or the appearance of an undivided self, right? But the other idea that we need to understand in terms of the whole house is the idea that Dr. Jekyll, by not selling his house, because the reason why a person converts their old, beautiful Victorian house into flats is a pretty simple idea. It's the simple, usually the symbol of capitalism, of money, right? They want to make money. Money is what's working. Now, I'm not sure the blue is showing up really well. Person who's watching my lecture, can you nod if the blue is showing up on the board? Okay, good. So I couldn't really tell personally. So the idea about this particular kind of contrast, the thing that we need to understand is that Jekyll, right, is a symbol of someone not in decline. And I say that again, a symbol of someone not in decline. While everyone else is selling out, right? You ever heard that phrase, selling out, right? While everyone else is literally selling out, Jekyll is holding on to this beautiful old house intact. He's holding on to tradition. And what we have is this idea of kind of the slow decline of society. And the idea, right, just as Victor Frankenstein lied about the experiments, about the grave robbing, about not creating a monster, we have Jekyll, who he is actually going in through decline, but he's holding on to the edifice, right, the surface, the veneer, right? He's holding on, again, we have that word edifice, right? An edifice refers to the surface or veneer, right? edifice is usually associated with a monument, right? He's holding on to this edifice that everything is pure and everything is respectable and nothing's going bad, right? In some ways, what we see is the apartments that have been turned into flats, right? That's kind of acknowledging the fact that the neighborhood is changing, but symbolically, on a larger scale, because this is 1886, a new world is dawning, it's an acknowledgement that society is changing, right? And that the world is actually more complex than the good and the strict good and evil that we think about sometimes. In contrast, Jekyll is in denial of this. At least he's in denial of this by his, he actually doesn't believe this. He believes that the world is much more complex. But the idea that we need to understand is that Jekyll, in resembling the old guard, is kind of in denial about the evil around it, right? The idea is that since there's obviously a lot of class symbolism going on, right? When you have a neighborhood where you can have rich people and then you can also have poor people that are only a few doors down, there are these invisible barriers between neighborhoods, right? It's kind of funny that when you go to live in a place, if you ask the locals, they know, even if there are no signs, where it's safe to walk, where it's not safe to walk. And sometimes the safety of neighborhoods can change like that immediately, and you wouldn't even know unless you're from there. In Victorian England, because of the way in which the class structure was very supported, right? And this is still true today. In the United States, the thing that's going to affect whether or not someone solves your murder, not saying any of you are going to get murdered, but if it were to happen, the thing that's most likely going to determine whether or not they solve that murder is where they find your body. Where are you from? Where does the body drop? If you're murdered in certain parts of the United States and certain parts of the inner cities, then it's very likely that your murderer will never be found. The idea in this case is that it's not that the police didn't see murders all the time. It's not that the police didn't see violence all the time. But it was understood that the poor, and particularly the really low poor, they knew they were not allowed to harm the upper class, right? They knew that if any of them harmed the upper class, the whole might of the government, the might of the police, the might of the greater social force would come down on them like a giant hammer, like Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, smashing them into oblivion. Because of that, because there was a certain protectedness of being in the upper class, because they had the arm of civilization defending it, they could also live in denial about a lot of the crime and a lot of the horror of the world around them. So what's interesting is there's a symbol of the wholeness of Jekyll's, house on display. There's even though Jekyll truly knows about the nature of evil, there's a certain public denial of it, right? While the complexity of the flats next door can be used as a symbol of the idea of how the world is becoming more complicated. There's a certain willful ignorance that happens in Victorian society where even though they talk about ideals and they talk about morals all the time, there are a lot of people who are living in absolute squalor only a few doors down, and they can pretend that it doesn't happen. They can pretend that it doesn't happen because their world is insulated by the protection of police, insulated by money, insulated by servants, and insulated by living in giant mansions where no one can talk to you unless they get past 2 or 3 levels of your staff, right? It's very much a world of the haves and the have-nots. So interestingly enough, Jekyll, who is actually trying to change all that with his experiments, in outwardly, because he knows all of his experiments are secret and banned and considered heretical, he has to promote this old edifice, this conformity to the Victorian ideal. Interestingly enough, when we notice that Dr. Jekyll is normally considered the symbol of good, right? Because normally with the duality in Jekyll and Hyde, right, it's simple. We think, oh man, this marker just doesn't. It's like none of my markers want to cooperate. Maybe this one will, maybe this one will write a little darker. Oh, this one's much better. Thank goodness. All right. So with Jekyll, right, he's normally considered to be the good, right? But it's actually not that simple because Jekyll is already doing things, right? He's already committing hypocrisy. He's already committing deception. So I think what's interesting and what's something to look at, I think this is Stevenson's intention, is that in the duality of Jekyll and Hyde, Jekyll is actually only mostly good. He has some good intentions, right? But in his attempt to suppress the evil within himself and the separation of it with Mr. Hyde, One of the reasons why a lot of critics think that Mr. Hyde is eventually going to take over and take control from Henry Jekyll is there's no balance between good and evil between Jekyll and Hyde. You have Jekyll, who's mostly good, and then you have Hyde, who is totally evil. And when you have Jekyll, who's only mostly good, trying to balance the scale of Hyde, who's totally evil, it's not 100 this way and 100 this way. It's more like 80 this way and 100 this way. And so the evil is going to, it's going to slowly but surely eventually take all the way over in terms of the scale, right? The reason why this is important to discuss, and the reason why we need to understand this, is Jekyll is not going to be someone who's going to think that human nature is not complex. But at the whole time, even though he does think that human nature is complex, and he does think that there are at least two men inside of us, if not more men inside of us, at the same time, because he wants his respectability in society, because he wants to be loved and admired, and he wants all the benefits of society, he's going to do a lot of his very heretical and dangerous experiments without anyone seeing him, right? He's going to be trying and going into the dark side here, away from the blessing of society, away from accountability, away from prying eyes. And this is the same thing that we see in Dr. Frankenstein, an ambitious scientist who, because he keeps pursuing his goal and pursuing his goal and pursuing his goal, he ends up separating himself from society and the grace of the natural law, the grace of what society can do to bring him back in, to rein him back into sanity. Jekyll and Frankenstein are going to go too far, even with a good intention. So what we need to understand is, even though Jekyll is considered the good part of the story, Jekyll, right, is actually making the mistake of hypocrisy. He's actually making the mistake of underestimating the evil in himself and underestimating how much he has the ability to control what he's doing, right? There's a similar curse to this, right? There's this idea of how Prometheus, right, stole fire from the gods to give it to humanity, and he was therefore punished for all eternity. The idea, right, the idea of playing God and going too far into knowledge, right? There's once again the idea of the Icarus metaphor, which we talked about in the last part of society. But also, and this is what's also much more important, is the idea of, in order to deal with evil correctly and in order to understand evil correctly, we cannot either treat it like it's invisible, hide it in the corner, right? We have to deal with it in an open and honest way. We can't close our eyes, right? The complexity is in the middle, right? There's a certain complexity in the middle in being able to look at evil right in the face, still be disgusted by it. You may notice that the interesting thing, Utterson called him abominable, right? Which we know means both evil and disgusting, right? And this is known, right? But the pattern of Victorian England, and this is a critic of society as a whole, is this abominable parts of London, the real awful things that are going on: child labor, child prostitution, child slavery, just massive amounts of evil things. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're even infringing on the very neighborhoods of the rich because they're near downtown, they're near the city, right? This doesn't seem like an unfamiliar story. They've tried to ignore it. They've tried to turn away from the ugly, right? And the solution, according to Utterson, what he says to Henry Jekyll is, make a clean breast of it, confess it, let's bring it into the light. The idea is Edward Hyde is created in the darkness and he's grown in the darkness, right? Utterson's trying to get him away from that, trying to get Jekyll to come into the honesty, into the light. In the same way, the supposedly supermoral people of London, by turning a blind eye to all of the horrible things that are going on the streets, the prostitution, the crime, the murder, the exploitation of the poor, they have turned a blind eye and benefited from it. And because of that, that dark fungus, right? Just like when you don't wash your feet and you just leave your feet there, right? How do you kill fungus? You get it to the light. In the same way, the darkness and the crime and the evil of London has been growing so much right underneath their feet that it now threatens all of them and even threatens society itself. Anyway, that's it, and we'll see you next time. Jesus loves you, so do I. Sorry, I've got 2 seconds left.